Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third session of You Say You Want a Revolution, Jewish Encounters with Radical Change. My name is Ellie Gettinger. I'm the Director of Outreach for the Center for Lifelong Learning. And this week starts kind of a minor sub-theme in this series. We're going to be exploring the way people read and how the reading of text has changed the way we understand our text. And today, Dr. Robbie Harris will introduce us to the concept of Peshat, a concept so simple that it's in its name itself. And yet it didn't come around. It was thousands of years of Jewish history and reading before this concept emerged. So I'm excited to hear about its evolution and why this is a revolution. I want to thank our sponsors today, Drora and Mati Shalev, for their generous support in honor of their friend, Dr. Moti Arad. Dr. Arad introduced them to the world of JTS learning, and we're so pleased that he did. Any of you could also join the ranks of Drora and Mati by making a donation. The link will be in the chat. I also want to thank you all to the many people who made donations before the series even started, and this is a really key part of being able to provide JTS learning to you in this webinar form. So today, as I said, we're looking at Peshat, the reinvention of reading during the 12th century Renaissance. And our speaker today is Dr. Robert Harris. He's a professor of Bible and ancient Semitic languages. He's an expert in the history of medieval biblical exegesis and is currently writing a book on this subject. So this always feels like a great thing when we can get a preview performance before, and as the book is in kind of its liminal state. He's a past president of the Society for the Study of Bible in the Middle Ages. And in addition, he's taught many online classes for our community learning universe. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with Dr. Harris, but if you want to throw your hands up, if you're a former student, we'd love to, you can do those reactions, give us smiley faces, give us whatever. And we're excited that you guys.
I like the heart emoji where they just show me love.
Oh, yes, that's always a good one, too. Okay. Oh, we got at least one student here. So I'm going to, there are going to be times for questions at the beginning, not at the beginning, sorry, in the middle and at the end. And you're going to send those questions to me. For technical questions, please message my colleague, Tani Schwartz-Herman. And our sources for today are going to be shared on the screen, but Tani is also going to share them in the chat. Thank you, Tani. You're the best. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Harris.
Well, thank you, Ellie. First, I'd like just to say one thing that I strenuously object to Ellie, who said that anything we're doing today is a subset or not. I mean, this is the most important thing ever, okay? And I say that with love and affection, of course.
The revolution of all revolutions.
The revolution of all revolutions. I live in the 12th century CE. That's really, but the truth is, most of us do and just don't realize it, right? Which is, what do I mean by that? When we were little and we learned, how to read, we had a pregame, right? Before let's say we were 5, 6, long before that, our caregivers held us in their laps. They read us books, they sang songs. And if you think about, I don't know, a 10-month-old baby, is that baby reading? No. But is the baby in hearing the story being read to that baby by the loving caregiver? This is my image anyway, right? That baby is taking in a relationship of warmth, of security, right? Is being held already from the get-go. There's love there, right? But we wouldn't say that baby is reading, right? If you jump at about, I don't know, 2 years, right? Now you're holding a toddler on your lap, and if you go, the cat in the, she'll be able to say hat, right? And finish all your lines, and we would say still not reading, but there's a lot more ownership of the text, right? And then, before you're a little tired, maybe you're going to skip a few pages. The child, after they go, no, you're skipping, and we'll make you go back because he or she knows the text, still not reading, but there's more of a firm ownership of that text, of that story. She might be able to recite the whole thing, but still not reading. And then you get to what I like to say are the three most important words that any of us, likely enough, in this room, this Zoom room, have ever experienced is our see, spot, run. Right? What happens at see, spot, run in our development as future readers is we are being given the skills that before that only the important caregivers had, and we were passive but growing more active was the story I was telling. But from see, spot, run on, we are being given by the educational system the tools through which to decipher the text on our own. You know, we get the little picture, the girl has got the ball and the dog is running, so she says see, spot, run, or however it went down. That was my little red storybook in Shaker Heights back in the day. But that was the moment at which I started to read. And I would guess that for most of us, it was kind of like that. So when I speak about the revolution in the 12th century, what we call Peshat, which we'll come back to, I like to say that from a figurative point of view, it's the same process, that almost all Bible reading, I won't make the case for Christianity, but it's there. But certainly for Jews, the reading that we did was almost entirely Ba'al Peh. We call that in Hebrew Torah Sheba'al Peh, or the oral Torah. And other than the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, nothing is written down. Now, that might be strange. The Mishnah, the Talmud, you're going to tell me it wasn't written down? Yes, I'm going to tell you it wasn't written down. Okay, it wasn't really written down until just around our period, the 10th, the 12th century CE. Most of the time, midrash or Talmud occurred in antiquity was oral. Okay, now I called that process midrash, right? What does that mean? That means that somebody was reading a text from the Bible, usually the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, the Torah, sometimes known as the Pentateuch, right? The 5 books of Moses are read by the rabbis, discussed by the rabbis, and interpreted by the rabbis. They are seeking lessons in the Torah. They were dorshim, that's that word, to seek, darash, dalid resh shin, de reshe, right? And the things that they found as a result of their seeking in the Torah, we put an M in front of that, are called midrash. Midrash is the story of rabbinic Judaism creating Torah law, Torah norms, great stories, Abraham in the idol shop, whatever you want to say. Lighting candles on Friday night, not in the Torah, but it's taught midrashically as something derived from or sought in the written Torah. Now, that is one model. If we had a longer time, we could talk about other models, but that's the strongest model that affects what we're doing today, which is distinguishing what was this revolution about in the 12th century. So this idea that we used the Torah as a vehicle to teach about Judaism, again, whether it was theology or liturgy or halacha, all of that is a result of the process of midrash. Named Tani Schwartz, which is not an unimportant name, but it wasn't where we were before. So Tani, maybe you could switch that back up to show the handout, because we're about to start scrolling. Let me know if there's a problem, and I'll just cry and weep. No, there it goes again. Okay, so that something happens that changes that oral midrash way of encountering the Bible or of accessing the Bible. But notice I don't say reading the Bible, because it was different than what we were doing when we learned how to read. All I have to say is character, plot, foreshadowing, parallelism, structure, right? Any of those things that, denouement, right? Any of those things that we talk about reading a text, we cannot find really in the world of Midrash from the time of the ancient rabbis until the Middle Ages. Now, I focused on the 12th century, and that's the one that we're going to be looking at today. In a different session, we might have wanted to start this conversation a few centuries earlier in the Judeo-Arabic encounter, maybe even the 9th or 10th century. But because most of us learned about the Bible through the people we're going to be looking at today, that's why I decided to start in the 12th century. It's 12th century northern France. This is right around the time when the first European universities are going to get started, and European university thinking then guides not just the West, but eventually guides the entire world by the modern period. So I like to look right at this period. Now, Tanya, if we can scroll up a little bit, or scroll down if you prefer. A typical way of us making a distinction between the drash that I just talked about and what we're about to start talking about, which is Peshat. This is as good as an example as any. We just had it in the Torah reading. This is the famous story of Abraham, Isaac, and the near sacrifice of Abraham's son. And if you, I'm going to look at the Hebrew, which is that third word, dvarim, and it means, well, you don't see it in this English translation. It literally says, and it happened after these dvarim, after these dvarim, after these events, after these things. Yes, we could say that that's probably what it means, and that's why the NJPS decided to translate it sometime afterward, but there's no words to say sometime after. This is a very idiomatic translation. But if you look into the Hebrew, achar hadvarim, this story about Abraham and Isaac happened after these dvarim. Now, the word dvarim almost definitely in this context means the events of the previous chapter, right? As it's a linking device saying that this happened, what we call chapter 22, happens after chapter 21 and going backwards. But the rabbis didn't look at it that way. And they said, you maybe scroll down a little bit more now. Rashi, the famous 11th century rabbi, who's really started the whole revolution that we're going to be talking about, he primarily begins as a teacher of Midrash. And he says, what does this mean after the things? It doesn't mean things. It means words. Divarim also can mean word in biblical Hebrew. And he brings two midrashim. Sometimes it says, the rabbi said it means after the words of Satan, who denounced Abraham. And the others, if you skip down to line 4, that others say that means after the words of Ishmael, who boasted to Isaac. So there are two interpretations given here, each of them rooted in an ancient midrash. It was already ancient by Rashi's time. And I want to ask you, right? It's not the kind of thing where I can actually get the answers, but you'll ask questions if you want to. Is Satan a character in Genesis 22? Was there an issue of Satan and God having a prior conversation, that there was a test? You're skipping around too much, Tanya. Please hold the screen. Obviously, we could look far and near in the book of Genesis and not see anything about Satan. But we do, if we know the Bible really well, we could look to the book of Job. Oh my gosh, way there in the end of the Bible, there's a book of Job. And Job was this good guy, a hero. And you know the story. Satan says, oh, to God, oh yeah? He wasn't such a good guy. He's only good because you rewarded him. Put him to the test. God says, you know what? Good idea. And God, being in that context a capricious, God who makes Job suffer, right? Puts him to the test. So some ancient rabbi said, just like God put Job to the test at Satan's insistence in that book, so too did it at this book. It's just that the Torah doesn't tell us that, but it hints at it through this word devarim. So they build this entire prequel kind of narrative, glomming it onto the beginning of Genesis, what we call Genesis chapter 22, not actually in the Bible at all, but there midrashically. Now, I will say to you, when we talk about our rules of reading, again, going back to see, spot, run, teacher would say, you're not allowed to do that. You can't bring in a character just because you think the character is there. This is not the Game of Thrones. There's no monsters. There's no, you got to read what it's there. Nouns, verbs, let story flow. It's a stark narrative, yada, yada, yada. Nothing about Satan there. Right? And there's also, if you want to go on with the second one, there's nothing about a conversation between Isaac and Ishmael. And certainly in that second midrash, Isaac is the star, even though in the Bible it looks like Abraham is the star, because it says God tested Abram. Okay, so Rashi is reflecting here the old world that he had inherited, and he was still doing the things that he typically learned how to do, citing long-established midrashim to amplify the biblical text. Now, the question is, you would say, and by the way, we asked this to this very day, why would God tell Abraham to do such a horrific thing? What are the circumstances that would have led God to say to Abraham, sacrifice your son? I mean, Bob Dylan is still singing about that in 1965. We don't know. So the idea here among the rabbis that Rashi is citing is it provides an answer for that question. God didn't really want Abraham to sacrifice his son. He was involved in this test just like he was in the book of Job. Now, you and I would look at that story and we would say, this is a fantasy. You're overreading, you're reading into. We would critique that as not in consonance with the rules of reading that we were trained in, beginning with see, spot, run. Okay? The question is, where did those rules come from? I would submit to you that the rules that we have about reading were not born like Venus in the sea all at once, but they had an origin. So if you would, Tani, move the text up a little bit to Rashi on Genesis 3:8. That's great. We're going to just center that. Now, this is arguably one of the most important moments in the history of reading in the West, right? What Rashi says here. Why he says it in this particular Genesis chapter 3, verse 8 is not something we're going to take up right now. But what he does say here is really, really, really significant. And by the way, it's significant both for Christians and Jews. So what does he say here? This is before he actually gets, it's the middle of the Adam and Eve story. You could look it up at home if you want to. He says, by the way, there are lots of midrashim on these verses. And the rabbis have long ago arranged them in their proper place in Genesis, Rabbah, Bereshit, Rabbah, and the other midrashim, particularly the Babylonian Talmud. By implication, you want to study midrash? Go study midrash there. Open those books, right? They were books by that point. Whereas, line 2, Va'ani lo bati ela lifshuto shel mikra. Rashi says, I have only come to explain scripture according to its plain meaning. Lifshuto shel mikra, and then he adds another category, and according to the Agadah that settles a matter of scripture and its sense, yada, yada, yada. So I will tell you that most people who study Rashi think that this is a statement in which Rashi says, I've really only come for Peshat. And I'm going to explain the word Peshat in just a second. But clearly, if you read this the way Rashi intended it, Rashi says, I'm interested in two things. Not one, but two things. One of them is this revolutionary new way of reading that we're about to define. But two, I'm also interested in midrashim that are, we would say, text sensitive. Now, this second category, this Agadah HaMiyashevet, if you can read the Hebrew, this Agadah that settles a matter of scripture, is probably not something we're going to talk about today. And in fact, even though it's revolutionary in the way that Rashi describes his selection process, ideationally, it's not a new way of reading. It's some sort of adaptation and continuation of the very old way of rabbinic reading. But this other category, Pshuto Shel Mikra, I have translated as the plain meaning, Pshuto, right? And Rashi never translated, never explained what he meant by it. And that's one of the reasons that all these years later, hundreds and hundreds of years, Rashi dies in the year 1205, so the beginning of the, 1105, beginning of the 12th century, right? So all these years later, we're still sort of duking out exactly what Rashi meant by that. The definition I have accepted was grounded in the work of two Bible scholars at the Hebrew University, Sarah Kamin, who died. She died in the 30 years ago, and more recently, my own teacher, Professor Sarah Yefet. Sarah died about a year and a half ago. I think it's hard to imagine, but they talked about what did the medievals who used this term Peshat mean. Now, if you think back at this term I used before, midrash, and I emphasize that it comes from three Hebrew letters, Dalet, Resh, and Shin, which means to seek, and midrash therefore being that which is sought, right? The lessons that are sought in Scripture. Peshat is a completely different process, and it is absolutely revolutionary, and that's why it fits today's theme. Peshat, Pei, Shin, Tet, is originally it could be a butcher's term, right? It could be what happens after you shecht an animal and take off its hide in order to get the meat. I hope if we have vegetarians here today, that you're not offended that I use that as a reference, but that is one of the meaning. Or if you think about Aaron in Leviticus chapter 16 on Yom Kippur, he takes off the linen garments, he puts on the golden garments, he takes off the golden, he puts on the linen. What does the Hebrew say? Ufashat et bigdei habad asher alav. He took off the linen garments that were on them. So the idea of taking off or stripping off clothing is a term that seems to be employed here. Now, bracket. Almost all the rabbis who use the term will cite a line from the Babylonian Talmud. And this line says, it's 5 Hebrew words, Ein mikra yotzei midei pshuto. Scripture never escapes the hands of a yadayim shel. It's pshuto, again, not translated, right? This is a line that occurs basically one time with an echo of 2 other times, so a total of 3 times in the entire Babylonian Talmud, in all of the Yerushalmi, in all of the ancient works of Midrash. It only appears really 1 plus 2 times. In other words, it's not important in antiquity, whatever it meant. But for reasons that are indisputable, I think, rabbis choose to read into this obscure line in the Babylonian Talmud as the fundamental approach to reading that they are articulating in, again, a very revolutionary way in the 12th century. So I want us to think about what this means. Pshuto here is in opposition to what Rashi calls Agadah HaMiyashevet, the rabbinic midrash. So what might it mean? What it means here is the reading that is unadorned by rabbinic midrash, just what the words say. Now, if you ask Rashi, what do the words mean? They meant what the rabbis made them read. But if you're just reading, what do they say? They say this. And this is the beginning of the revolution that we're talking about, because Rashi basically says there's more than one way to skin a cat. I can read this text lefi pshuto shel mikra, according to its pshat. It's stripped away, laid bare, meaning that is not told with all the amplifications of the rabbinic Beit HaMidrash or study, right? And I can also look back at Midrash, right? Now, for Rashi, this is a big moment since Rashi is extraordinarily influential among the rabbis that come after him. This is like the key term. This point of departure, there's nothing like it. That's why I say it's arguably among the most important moments in reading in the history of the West. I'll bracket a thought in case it piques your curiosity. There were churchmen contemporary with Rashi who end up reading Rashi very early. Sometimes they copy his words, sometimes they translate him into Latin. He is very, very important. And Rashi himself is born into a world that has completely reinvested its learning in the ancient rhetoric of Rome, right? How to read, how to argue, how to imagine the composition of a text. It's very, very significant. And this is really the heart and soul of my book, how this process just didn't pop up out of Rashi's imagination in the 11th or the beginning of the 12th century, but in fact was rooted in everything that was going around him in the cultural world of Christianity into which he was born. More on that if you're interested. Otherwise, hey, I'll finish the book and you can read the book. At any rate, Tani, if you could scroll down a little bit now, I would appreciate it. So I will tell you that I am about 10 years, 11 years into the most glorious part of my life. I became a grandfather. Okay. If you want, I can share pictures. No, I have been blessed with 5 grandchildren, and I am so proud every time they do one accomplishment or another. I could spend the rest of the time talking about it. Never mind. Why do I bring that up right now? Because the next fellow on the page, Rashbam, is Rashi's grandson. Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir is the grandson of Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, right? So think now 12th century northern France. And at a mere 2 generations removed from Rashi, Rashbam grows up in Rashi's household, studies with grandpa, probably plays ball with grandpa because that's what you do with grandchildren, but never mind. He's reading with his grandfather, and very early on, he starts critiquing his grandfather. Like, I don't know if this ever occurred to you in your household where your children, if you're blessed with children, think they know more than you do, right? We could probably think back about that. And even if you were not blessed with children, you know what goes on in society. The new generation, they think you don't know anything. 2 generations later, they definitely think you don't know anything, right? A grandson said to me the other day, "Are you Generation X? Are you Generation Y? Or what generation are you?" I didn't get what he meant at first. I said, "I think we were called baby boomers." I think it just doesn't have a gen letter. But so we talked about that. Rashbam, 2 generations later, is born into a world where everybody in the world of Beit Midrash already knows the difference between Pshat and Drash. He knows that Rashi, who introduced this idea up above in the commentary on Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, and then practiced it all during his life, didn't do it so well. In fact, if you were to take a statistical analysis of Rashi's commentary, you would find that some 75% of Rashi's commentary is midrash. Didn't look so revolutionary, batted at only 250, right? 1 out of every 4, right? And even some of the pshat that is in Rashi's commentary, it's really Rashbam. It's really later rabbis that in the copying of Rashi's commentary got glommed onto the page, because the way you copy texts, remember, this is all handwritten. Printing has not yet been invented for another 500 years, basically. So Rashbam really represents the thorough beginning of Pshat as a singular way of approaching the Bible. And he says that here in in Exodus 21:1, the beginning of what we call Parshat Mishpatim. And he echoes what, as he'll say, what he already said a couple of times very deeply in Genesis. Now, why am I focusing on Exodus chapter 21? Think, if you will, just for the moment, that up until Exodus 21, the Torah is mainly a book of stories with a few laws. And in Exodus 21, it's the fulcrum around which the Torah changes to being a book fundamentally about laws with a few stories. So it's a very significant moment. And we're going to do this and maybe pause for some questions. But he says, let knowers of wisdom know. Now, when we think of the maskilim that he refers to, generally people, oh, the Middle Ages, they're talking about philosophy. They're not, it's not philosophy for him. It's rhetoric. Trust me on that for now, and we can talk about it later if you want to. I have not come to explain halachot. Oh my God, don't tell that in the Brooklyn yeshivas, right? Here's the greatest rabbi of his generation, the grandson of Rashi. He's getting to the text in the Torah that finally gets to the mitzvot, the halakha, the Jewish law. And he says, here, I'm not going to give you halachot. even though they are the ikar. And that word is the third from the last on the first line. Ikar, the most important thing ever. So here's this rabbi, Rashi's grandson. What's the most important thing? Halacha, right? But when we're studying, what's the most important thing? Pshat. Now, if that sounds just a little bit like the Jewish Theological Seminary, then you know you've come to the right place. Because we conservative rabbi types, and yes, I am a rabbi, uh, we say we have a fundamental fidelity to Jewish law as it is construed by our authorities today. But when we study with historical development, with critical methodologies. We study the Bible with archaeology and critical theory and the whole 9 yards. We make a distinction between what did the Torah mean in the Iron Age and what does the Torah mean in the year 2525. The distinction between those two things I just said in English are essentially the differences between drash and pshat. When we want to know what the Torah meant in antiquity, we're thinking pshat. When we want to know what does the Torah mean when I listen to the rabbi's sermon on a Shabbos morning, or how it animates me in my conduct with my fellow human beings, that's midrash, right? We live our lives as Jews according to midrash, not according to pshat, but we study, at least here at JTS, we study according to pshat. And Rashbam is dedicated to this. And he says, even though the ikar is halacha, I am only going to do pshat in my own approach. He says, I have come to explain the contextual meaning of Scripture, and I will explain the laws and halachot according to realia, the way of the world, meaning presumably what the words meant in antiquity and even possibly how the Torah was practiced in antiquity, which is a longer conversation. But don't forget, halacha uproots Scripture. We don't live our lives according to the Torah. I usually say Baruch Hashem. We live our lives according to halacha, right? We don't burn witches. We don't stone Sabbath desecrators. It's right there in the Bible. We're not going to listen to the Bible, the Holy Bible. No, we don't. We follow halacha, which is the end process of a long series of interpretive moments that stretch back to antiquity down to the present day. Rashbam upholds that system, but introduces to that system a new way of reading, something that he had learned from Rashi, but perfected. By the way, I go back to the proud grandfather, and then we'll take a break, Ellie. Rashi is so proud of Rashbam that he says, you know, if I had the time, even now as an old man, right, I would redo my entire works, all of my commentaries in light of this principle about pshat. But in the meantime, anytime I come to something that I have studied with my grandson, I'm going to call them Psukei de Shmuel, Samuel's verses, because I'm so proud of my Torah learning that I have gotten from my grandson. Okay? So I think by convention, I'm supposed to stop about halfway. And
Here we are.
Here we are. Ellie, if you have questions,
fire. Questions. I think, well, the first is the sense that, so Rashi had been commenting and then suddenly had this epiphany about pshat. And so the earlier commentary, the first commentary you showed us, is this was a pre-pshat moment.
Well, not exactly. What's fair to say is that Rashi never really gets it. Rashi lives his whole life doing mostly midrash. But what he does, I'll tell you, sometimes you may have heard your rabbi say, it's one of my bet noirs, where the rabbis will say, our rabbis will say, in the ancient commentaries of the Talmud. I want to go, no, there are no ancient commentaries. The idea of writing a commentary in Hebrew by a rabbi on a sacred text, it begins fundamentally with Rashi, right? There are interpretations, there are midrashim, almost entirely sheba al peh. Remember, Torah sheba, orally delivered, orally preserved. But the idea of glossing a text, that technology is something, part of my scholarship that tries to demonstrate this, is something that he takes from the Christians surrounding, because they were glossing commentaries for hundreds of years before then. But Rashi never really gets it. He does only a little bit of Peshat. That's the batting average. So I chose Genesis 22 because it was Quran, it was right in the Torah reading, and people sort of know that story. And it's easy to see what we would say the kind of outlandish nature of Midrash as it reads scripture.
So there are a couple of questions about where this fits into a timeline. And I'm going to kind of dovetail these together. We have one person who's like, but didn't the Samaritans interpret Chumash by Peshat prior to Rashi? And then were the Karaites doing this? That's how the Karaites are doing this. And then, the last of these kind of timeline questions is, how do we take into account Rashi's place in time and history on our understanding of his commentaries? So
Good.
let's
Good.
throw all those three together, and then we'll run after that. We'll get back to your presentation.
Sure. So the Samaritans and the Dead Sea Scroll community and the Maccabees, there was, in Latin, I would say interpretatio, there was interpretation of scripture, and some of them are written down. We have Dead Sea Scrolls of interpretations. But that did not feed into Rabbinic Judaism. When you and I talk about Judaism, we're talking about Rabbinic Judaism. So the questioner who asked about the Karaites is kind of alluding to what, is pointing to what I alluded to in my introduction. We could have started our analysis of this revolution in the 9th century, right? The Karaites are sort of alive and functioning as the majority about 200 years before Rashi, but in the Islamic world, Arabic writing and speaking, and they are following trends in the Islamic world of interpreting according to scripture. Obviously, for the Muslims, it's Quran. For the Karaites, it's Mikra, and they choose that term. Karaim goes back to Mikra, scripture, because they wanted to do in a cosmopolitan way what the learned Muslims were doing with respect to the Quran. Rav Sadi Gaon, who would be influential in just a moment when we look at Ibn Ezra, he kind of like fights the battle against the Karaites, again, 9th century Middle East, almost entirely in Arabic also. And he says, no, we can do exactly what the Karaites are doing, except when it comes to halakha. And we have to follow halakha, and he makes a programmatic statement of his own. The reason I didn't want to deal with that today so much is because it all happens in Arabic, and nobody in Christian Europe reads Arabic until well after our period, right? Mm-hmm. So that the foundation of this revolution that is Rashi based, right, and feeds into the West, the creation of the university system, etc., all that really happens before they know Arabic. So it happens in the interaction between the scholars of rhetoric in medieval France and flows from that into the foundation of the university. So I just wasn't going to talk about the Karaites today, but the questioner alludes to something that is quite accurate. By the way, but most of the Karaite commentaries are in Arabic, and therefore not so influential until much later, and never really influential like the rabbi commentaries. Rashi is so popular so quickly that hundreds of manuscripts survived the ravages of the Middle Ages. Rashbam survives in a single manuscript. He almost didn't survive at all, basically, but Rashi did. So people continue to study Rashi because he was the great survivor and printed as soon as printing was invented. Okay? We ready for me again? Okay. So if Tani, if you can pop the source sheet back up, and now we're going to scroll down a little bit. Abraham Ibn Ezra, Introduction to the Torah, Part 5, excerpt. So what I said is that the idea of Peshat is introduced in Europe in the way that was sort of in the 2 generations or so between Rashi and Rashbam, and it was refined in the spirit of the Beit Midrash. Now think about what Midrash is like, or what the Beit Midrash, a cacophony of voices, all arguing, I interpret this way, I interpret that way, no, here's another interpretation, oh, wait, here's yet another. And the way those individual interpretations are strung together, really ad infinitum, they could go on and on forever, is by the concept of davar acher. You might have heard this. You might have seen it in the Holy Maxwell Sagada during the Passover Seder. Devarach, here's another interpretation, right? None of us object to that. It's, oh my gosh, it sort of runs in antiquity, in perpetuity, right? Now, the world of the Beit Midrash that supports that has a concept, shiv'im panim b'Torah. The Torah has 70 facets, 70 meaning infinity or n, right? It means you can have lots of interpretations. When Pshat was invented or discovered or developed by Rashi, Rashbam and their circles in 12th century northern France, it was alongside of the Midrash, right? Or the Midrashim. So for those rabbis, Pshuto shel Mikra or Pshat was one more of the 70, right? If the Torah could be interpreted 70 ways, then one of them was Pshat and the rest of them were Midrashim. No conflict. The upshot, if you don't mind me saying that, sorry, you may figure out I love wordplay. The upshot is that the Torah is multivalent. It can mean more than one thing at one and the same time, or put differently, it is strong enough of a text and a tradition to contradict itself and all of it somehow be truthful, right? When back in the day in rabbinical school, we could study a sugya in the Babylonian Talmud, a section of the Talmud, a whole page, right, based on the opinion of a rabbi named Abaye. Cue to when you start studying Talmud, you never listen to Abaye. The halacha always goes to somebody else. So you're studying, the wrong guy, the wrong answer. We said to the professor at the time, well, is this Torah? How do we relate to it if it's not the right understanding? He says, say Kaddish D'Rabbanan now, we're done, right? Because even studying a wrong opinion, quote unquote, is still an opinion of Torah. It's holy. It's a beautiful thing. By the way, studying the wrong thing, the wrong opinion, we do that in law schools all the time. People have. There's a whole history of jurisprudence about certain legal questions, but by studying them, we learn how the law developed. Those rabbis say no different, but Abraham Ibn Ezra is different. It reflects a different kind of understanding of what Pshat means. And he is, even though he's 300 years, he's also the 12th century. He also, I don't know if he actually meets Rashbam. I like to think of them meeting in northern France somewhere. But they lived pretty much, he's a little bit younger, the same time, because he leaves Spain for reasons that don't concern us today, travels to Italy, and there realizes that the Jews don't speak Hebrew. They don't know Hebrew as well as the Muslim Jew, the Jews in the Islamic orbit does. He writes commentaries. And then he moves from Italy to France. So he's basically down the street certainly from Rashbam's little brother, Rabbeinu Tam. They meet of a certainty. And he brings a different idea. He looks at himself like as a student of Rav Saadia Gaon, the rabbi who in the 9th century fought against the Karaites. And Abraham Ibn Ezra says, Saadia is the most important rabbi ever. You can make a good argument for that. And his idea begins differently. His idea begins with the same idea of Pshat, but there only can be one valid interpretation, nothing about multivalent. When the rabbis say, Ein mikra yotzei midei pshuto, the scripture always, never loses its pshat. That means the true meaning of the scripture is always its pshat. Then you say, well, oh my gosh, what happens when it looks like the pshat would contradict halacha? Because that happens all the time, right? Then Ibn Ezra would say, just like Saadia said, when God disclosed the Torah on Mount Sinai, did so together with the Torah Sheba'al Peh. This is an old rabbinic idea, by the way. You know from Pirkei Avot, Moshe Kibel Torah mi Sinai. Moses received Torah from Sinai. Many of us know that. It's in the Siddur, right? That text from the Mishnah is not talking about the Chumash. When it says Moshe Kibel Torah mi Sinai, it's talking about the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. Because according to rabbinic teaching, God disclosed the oral Torah to Moses at the time he gave the written Torah. It wasn't the product of Midrash. It was just given by God. And God caused certain pieces of the halacha to, you'll forgive the term, to adhere to a verse, because from God's divine perspective, that's what the verse meant. And the classic example, I don't know if we'll get to it if we have time, is that I choose to teach is tefillin, right? Tani, you might want to go down a little bit in the handout. See where it says Exodus 13. We'll probably end up having to leave this for another time, but go down, keep a little bit farther to verse 9. You see where it says, oh, no, that good. It shall be for you a sign upon your hand and a reminder between your eyes. When we see lines like that in the Bible, we think tefillin. Ukshartam liot al yadecha v'hayu l'totafot b'neinecha. Right? That's the parallel line from Deuteronomy that we daven all the time. But if you look at that through our ability to read a text, Peshat, there's nothing in the Bible about leather straps or little boxes that have scrolls in them. There's nothing about davening in the Bible. There's no crying in baseball. There's no davening in the Torah, right? All of that is the product of rabbinic midrash. Now, if you could scroll back up to where we were looking at Ibn Ezra, Ibn Ezra reflects a world that doesn't think about the multivalency of Scripture. He thinks about the singularity or the univocal nature of Scripture. And where we would be discomforted by a verse such as that one that looks like it doesn't have anything to do with tefillin, we should know that when God gave the Torah to Moses, God caused that verse to adhere to the halacha of tefillin in the Revelation. And that's what he says here. He says, here I am. This is, by the way, he wrote a long introduction. This is just a small part of part 5 where he says, study Torah my way. Look about 4 lines down. It says, in favor of Drash, the way of Peshat never turns aside. I'm translating literally, but we would start the sentence, the way of Peshat never turns aside in favor of Drash, meaning if Drash and Peshat would enter a dark alley and duke it out there, who's going to emerge victorious? Every time, Peshat. Peshat's the winner. Don't forget it. And then you go on, you get to the word except. Now, even though the Torah has 70 sides, what I'm arguing is except with regards to verses which deals with laws. It says statutes. It should be statutes. My apologies. Statutes, like legal stuff, not statues, idols. Laws, statutes, and regulations. In those circumstances, says Ibn Ezra, if we find 2 possible interpretations for a verse, and one of them is in keeping with the transmitters of tradition, Chazal, the rabbis, they are the ones we should follow. Heaven forfend that we should join the Sadducees, by which he means the Karaites. He's not really talking about Sadducees. The Karaites who claim that the traditions of the rabbis contradict the literal meaning of Scripture. The fact of the matter is that our ancient sages are true. They represent truth. All their words are true, and we should learn truth. Meaning, for Ibn Ezra, there's only one meaning to Scripture, that is Peshat, and therefore we have to dedicate our understanding to learning grammar, syntax, vocabulary, etc. So we'll understand the Bible in its own language, and we should do so rationally with reason. This is not mysticism. This is hardcore learning. But if we ever get to a verse that says, oh my gosh, it looks to me like the plain sense of that verse is utterly contradictory of halakha, please know that when God gave the Torah to Moses, he made it work out from God's perspective. And who are we? Nothing. We should just follow the halacha. Now, you can, I know it's getting late, so you can drop the source sheet and students will look at that source sheet elsewhere. We can just more look at everybody in the room here. Those ideas of Peshat, that of Rashbam and that of Ibn Ezra, are contradictory. They do not agree. They agree on the importance of Peshat. They know a Peshat interpretation when they see it. But for Rashbam, if he interprets according to a Peshat reading of Scripture, following his rules of reading, and it contradicts halacha, no problem. Torah can be multivalent. It can mean more than one thing at the same time. The ikar, follow the halacha, but don't be naive. We know what the words actually mean. Ibn Ezra says, "Who you call naive, buddy? You want to take this outside?" Right? God, for you think you know how to read Torah, God knows better. And God said when it got to he, God, knew that it meant tefillin, and we just have to follow that. So that's a revolution. It occurs all over the Jewish world, both in the world representing Sfarad or the Sephardic Jews and the Ashkenazic Jews. Now, when this happened, I would guess, I'm not a demographer, but I would guess 999 out of every 1,000 Jews lived in Spain or the Middle East. The Jewish community of Europe was tiny, very, very small, right? If you didn't have a minyan in your town to read Torah, close the whole town down, travel on Shabbos so you at least get to read Torah on Shabbat, right? These are very, very small communities. But jump it 500 years, all of a sudden there are 15 million Jews in Europe and the same 1 million Jews that were in the Muslim world. As Europe overtakes the world, the Jews of Europe in their numbers far outswell the Sephardic Jews. That's why the Arabic learning that occurred there is less significant in Christian Europe, certainly by the 15th, 16th century, because they're the winners. So the Jews of Europe honor Rashi. You could say, well, what happened to Peshat? Why is it still so problematic in the Brooklyn or the Mea Shearim yeshivas? Because what happens after the period of Rashbam and his children is the Christian church fundamentally destroys the Jewish community of Europe, right? The Jews are exiled from England in 1290, from France in 1306, from the Rhineland after that, and they suffer terribly during the Crusades. The Jewish community of Europe is absolutely destroyed. The idea of Pshat that had developed there was fundamentally forgotten because the text did not survive. As I said before, there's one copy of Rashbam, one copy of Rabbi Eliezer of Beaugency, one of my guys, Rashbam's principal student. It didn't survive. Ibn Ezra and Rashi were printed when printing was developed, and that those books really are, you're talking about the 1520s, that's when it really gets going. That is hundreds of years after there are no more Jews in Northern Europe. So the idea of Pshat did not survive there. And the only thing that survived was Rashi. Rashi's 75% midrash. It looks to those yeshiva bachurim, those yeshiva students, that 75%, that's Pshat. Midrash is Pshat if it's in Rashi. A complete misreading of what Rashi's revolution was all about. So the revolution, Eli, in short, was forgotten. It was not rediscovered until late in the 19th and the 20th centuries, when places like JTS and Hebrew University and Hebrew Union College started studying Bible again, and not just did so like the universities around them with archaeology and documentary hypothesis, etc., but rediscovering in the church libraries and old university libraries these odd manuscripts that reflected this other idea of learning from the 12th century. And now print them on the page. Now we study them, people like me, and write about them, and we emphasize their significance. But there's a gap of hundreds of years where they were not studied.
So you picked up
Ta-da!
the revolution.
You say you want a revolution, yeah. Oh,
I got to
okay.
say, as the person who came up with the title, I've been waiting for someone to do that. So thank you.
Hey,
Um,
by the way, I play in a band. We play in the bars, and just come to New York and see us perform.
I can't wait. Um, so I think what with this sense of shot and simplicity, what happens?
Wait. Oh,
Not
stop.
simplicity. Sorry,
Yes.
sorry, sorry.
I'm hyper about that because I like to say, if I've been dedicating my scholarly program to it and teach it in rabbinical school and everything like it ain't simple. But the
Okay.
plain meaning unadorned by rabbinic midrash. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
what happens when my sense of the plain meaning and your sense of the plain meaning are, yeah, not the
We
same?
duke it out, but that's what happens with critical inquiry, right? If my powers of persuasion beat yours, you might agree with me. Maybe you'll convince me, but that's what rhetoric is all about, the ability to convince somebody else, and that's what scholarship is all about. You know, somebody can publish something about, I don't know, the genetic code. Within a few, excuse me, a few years, we're going to be reassessing that, right? When Einstein created the theory of relativity and published a special theory in 19 whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
2 weeks before he did that, nobody knew it.
Mm-hmm.
Now everybody knows it, and Planck comes along 20 years later and says, "You know what, Einstein, you're really not all that," and he gets his right. And they've been duking it out about physics ever since, the same way they did in the Middle Ages about metaphysics, right? But that's what Torah learning is all about too. It means that if I can refine my idea of what the Torah meant, and then somebody, I don't know, discovers a new inscription that says, "Oh my gosh, no, it's different than that." Ooh, that's my science fiction music, right? Then things can change, right?
Um, and I don't know, we're at time, but do you have time for one more question? Or
I do, sure.
okay, and we actually have a couple minutes. So, and this is maybe outside the bounds, so you can say, nah, this isn't my perspective, but a couple of people brought this up where they really saw an interesting parallel to the contemporary Supreme Court with this sense of originalists versus more liberal justice, like the justices, the ones who are, we are
Yeah.
reading the plain text
So
meaning of the
let me break it
Constitution.
in. For years, I wanted to meet Scalia, right?
Mm.
And just talk to him about the difference between Pshat and Drash and see if that would inform his understanding of original right. I'm not a lawyer. And then it turns out that Samuel Alito, another originalist, went to high school with my guitarist wife. Okay.
Mm.
And she was going to her 50th high school reunion. I begged her to ask Justice Alito if he would agree to meet with me. She comes back from the thing. She says, "No, it was crowded. I couldn't bring myself." I went, but yes, I think there is an absolute parallel between learning in general and multivalency and originalism and the very conversation we're having about Pshat and Drash. Because, my teacher, Joel Roth in the Talmud department here now, emeritus, he used to say, if we could discover, thinking about American law, if we could discover that the Constitution was not really the product of the Constitutional Convention, but George Washington found it floating in a bottle in the Delaware River the night he attacked the Hessians. And it was actually written by the eminent British parliamentarian Edmund Burke over there in England. It was smuggled to the United States and proclaimed surreptitiously as the product of this secretive Constitutional Convention. It would have absolutely no effect on American law until and unless some judge, some court determined that that historical information was legally relevant. But in a history department, well, we'd be all over that. Like oh wow, that's so cool. We can now understand what wasn't going on at the Constitutional Convention, right? If you read Rabbi Roth's book, if you have, I'm just kidding. It's a very dense book about rabbinic jurisprudence, but he addresses that very question in, I think, the second to the last chapter of that book. The halachic process, a systemic analysis, reads like a novel. At any rate, that he takes up the idea of the implications of originalism in rabbinic law, and he says that basically it doesn't. Pshat, we don't paskin on the basis of pshat. We don't paskin on the basis of the Torah, right? And again, I usually go to my Monty Python moment. She's a witch, right?
Burn her.
Right? We don't apply that in our Judaism, because even though it meant that in the Iron Age, it stopped meaning that way long ago in rabbinic interpretation. So that's my response to originalism versus you see where I would
Yeah.
end up on that legal spectrum.
Well, and we have some people giving you suggestions. I'll send them to you after of other ways
I'd
to
love,
explore
if
this
if
issue.
you can put me in touch with Justice Alito, I would be so
Yeah,
happy.
anybody who wants to connect him with any of the originalists, very much appreciated. Um, so I just want to thank you. This has been enlightening. I have so many comments in the
Ellie, the pleasure was all yours. No, I'm just kidding.
well, no, and people are like, this is amazing. This was such great,
Yay!
wonderful talk teaching. So thank you very much for sharing
You're
with us.
so welcome.
I think that it's interesting to think of a revolution on hold and then picking up a revolution 500 years later, what that looks like and how we then continue a revolution. And
More like 700 or 800 years, but yes, it's a very sad development and a nice recovery.
um,
By the way, I think it has profound implications for conservative Judaism. I mean, and we are, if you will, conserving that aspect of our history and culture as compelling and important all these hundreds of years later, and applying them to our conceptual, approach to Jewish law. But anyway, I interrupted you.
no, I just thank you again. Next week, we're going to hear from Dr. Shira Billet. She's going to be talking about Herman Cohen and his conception of Ezekiel and why this is revolutionary. So
Okay.
continue the revolution with me next week. And thank you all so much for joining us. Dr. Harris, thank you.
All the very best to you. Ellie, my people will talk to your people.
Bye.
Okay, bye.